Likutei Sichos, Chelik Tezayin, that's volume 16, the second sicha for Parshas Terumah. This sicha actually is a unique sicha because in its original state it actually wasn't said as a sicha. It was actually delivered by the Rabbi as a formal Hasidic discourse, as a mimer, as we know it. It was rewritten in the same form as all the other Likutei Sichos, and it is actually very, very understandable and very applicable to our day-to-day life. I mean, in this sicha we're going to learn how the idea of the building, the constructing of the Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash that is, the temple, the tabernacle, how it applies and how it is effectively done in our day-to-day life. And also we're going to enjoy the uniqueness and the specificness of the wording in the Torah and even the nuances in the psukim and how that Hashem chose to deliver his message to us, to express his mitzvahs, how that brings out the inner essence of it all. So in the Parsha, in the second and third verse of our Parsha, which is essentially the beginning of the Parsha, we have three mentions of the Terumah, of the offerings that the Yidden were instructed to give for the construction, for the service of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. And the three mentions are, if you look in the verse, first it begins, it says, speak to the children of Israel, V'yikchu li terumah, and they shall take for me a terumah, an offering. Then it says that you shall take tikchu es terumasi, you should take my terumah. And then in the next verse it says, V'zois ha-terumah asher tikchu meitam, and this is the terumah, this is the offering which you shall take from them. And it specifies the gold, the silver, the copper, and all the various materials. There's actually a debate as to exactly the number that of the different types of materials, but whatever it is, all the materials that they were meant to offer, to donate for the construction of the temple. So Chazal tell us, the sages tell us, that these three terumahs, these three different mentions of the offerings actually correspond to three different offerings that the Yidden had to give. The first one that says, V'yikchu li terumah, they shall take for me an offering. That is a very specific offering that the Yidden gave, and as we'll see later, they gave exactly a half a shekel, the same amount each person gave. And that went for the purpose of the adonim, the sockets on which stood the entire structure of the Mishkan, meaning the foundation of the Mishkan. These were silver, big blocks, big silver sockets, which were made from these coins. The second one, which says, Tikchu es terumasi, you shall take my terumah, my offering, that is the terumah that is the offering of the shkalim, the half shekels, not the ones that went for the sockets, but the ones that they used for the purchase of the communal sacrifices, the daily offerings in the Mishkan. And in fact, this was something that was an annual consecutive thing. Year after year, they would collect it as they had a budget in order to cover the costs of all the sacrifices. And then the third one, V'zois ha-terumah shatikchu mitam, and this is the terumah which you take from them, all the various materials, that is for the construction of the Mishkan of the tabernacle. Now, if you look a little closely, if we take a little analytic look at these verses, you will see a very interesting distinction. And in fact, we can break down these three in two groups, the first two and the third one. The first two, if you look at it, it speaks in very broad terms, and it's kind of ambiguous. It doesn't specify as to what has to be done. In fact, when I told you that they took exactly a half a shekel, that we know from much later on, in a much later Parsha, Parshas Pekudei, where it specifies, or in Parshas Kisisa, where it specifies that you have to give a half a shekel. But here it just mentions it, it doesn't give us any detail. However, the last one, the third one, which is the offering for the construction of the Mishkan, that it goes into detail. It tells us all the various kinds of materials, and it doesn't tell us how much one has to give, but it says one has to give according to the offering, according to the goodness of their heart. But it tells us what. It goes into very specific detail what they're supposed to bring. Now it's obvious that all three of these are directly connected to the construction of the Mishkan. True, one could make the argument that perhaps the second one, which is the offering for the sacrifices, for the means of buying the communal offerings, perhaps one can argue, well, that is not really part of the construction of the Mishkan. But I have to tell you it is. Why? Because we know, and especially according to the Rambam, who is a leading authority on the construction of the Beis HaMikdash and its purpose, the Rambam states that the main purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, and in this case the Mishkan, is for the purpose of offering the sacrifices. In other words, the offerings, the daily offerings, is not just another thing in addition to the construction. That is the whole idea, that is the whole purpose, that is the whole objective of the construction of the Mishkan. And therefore it's part and parcel of it. And therefore the question is, this begs the question, why the difference in expression and in the detail and in the way it's presented between the first two offerings that are mentioned in these two psukim and versus the third offering. And I just make another argument, even if one should still insist on arguing that, look, the offering for the sacrifices is still not directly for the construction for the Mishkan. It's for the general purpose and idea. But here I can throw you back an argument. The Adonim, the sockets, are not only for the construction of the Mishkan, but they are an essential part of the Mishkan. Like I mentioned earlier, they are the foundation. They hold up the walls of the Mishkan, and yet there is no detail mentioned about them. So this already directs us to the point of realization that there's something going on here. The pasuk is choosing. Hashem chooses to emphasize something because this brings out, so to speak, the idea. This brings out the real, true point of this whole idea of building the Mishkan. Now, there's another difference between the first two and the last one. There's another difference between these Terumahs. When you look at the words, the way Hashem expresses it in the Torah, the first two have a very strong indication of connection to Hashem. Look at the words. It says, V'yikchu li, a whole word, li, to me, a Terumah. They shall take to me a Terumah. To me is to Hashem. In the second one, it also directs the Terumah to Hashem and connects it to Hashem, but already not in a separate word. But in this same word, it says Terumah si, which in English would be two words, but in Hebrew it becomes one word. Like it's a suffix to a word, to the word Terumah. My Terumah. But still, clearly pointing of this direct connection that it has to Hashem. V'yikchu, direct connection to Hashem. Terumah si, it includes Hashem in it. Whereas the third one, it just says, and this is the Terumah which you shall take, quote unquote. It doesn't say to me, it doesn't say for Hashem, my Terumah. Why the difference? And again, this is pointing us in a direction of realization that there is something special going on over here. The Torah is trying to teach us something. Now, to throw in something which we don't see clearly in the verses, but a very, very interesting medrash. The medrash tells us that when the verse specifies the various materials, and in general you can break them into a few groups that were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan, the Medrash tells us a very interesting thing, and it says, quote, the gold, the silver, the copper, and the red hides of the rams, the red ram hides, they actually correspond to 4 different stages of Golus. They correspond to 4 empires. The gold corresponds to Bavel, to Babylonia. and this is not the time or place to go into exactly how gold expresses that. The silver to Madai, okay, the Persian Median Empire. Nechoshes, the copper, corresponds to Yavan, the Greek, the Syrian Greek Empire. And the red hides, obviously, to Edom, which is Rome. Of course, the question is so obvious. What is the connection between building the Mishkan and these four empires? If anything, these four empires represent the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, or at least the attempt at the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, whereas here we're learning about the building of the Beis HaMikdash in its early stage, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So where would there be a connection? How can this be hinting to that? How can these materials that were essential in the building of the Mishkan be hinting to these four empires, which are inherently against this idea? They are inherently the antithesis of the building of the Mishkan. They were the ones who either actually brought about or sought to bring about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rebbe says, in order to understand all this, we'll first look at our building of the Mishkan. By taking a little examination of what it is that it takes for each and every Jew to build a Mishkan, to build a Mikdash. Now, when we say for us to build a Mikdash, we're talking about our general service of Hashem in this world, with this world, through this world. And that is represented in the verse, which is also in the early stage of this week's Parsha, V'asu limikdash v'shachanti b'saycham. Hashem says, they shall make for me a sanctuary and I'll dwell amongst them. And we know, of course, this refers to our mission, our purpose of doing Torah and Mitzvos and making the world into a place, as we know, a dira b'tachtonim, a dwelling place for Hashem down here in this world. Now, in general, this avodah, this service of Hashem, is divided into three, what we call three pillars, three different categories. You have Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. Torah is, of course, obviously the study of Torah, connecting to Hashem through that, to Torah study. And Avodah is the service of Hashem. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, it was implemented in the manner of offering the sacrifices. Nowadays, it's through tefillah, through davening, and connecting to Hashem that way. And then, of course, the mitzvahs, which in general is usually expressed with the idea of gemilas chasadim, of doing loving kindness, of doing tzedakah, and helping others, because that is the ultimate in all the mitzvahs. And this already can help us understand why is it that the Torah divided all the offerings into three categories. In other words, why didn't the Torah just say, here's the offering, everybody give whatever, or give a lot, give a half a shekel and give this and give that. One mention, because you can already see that there are three different paths, there are three different approaches, there are three different ways, three different modes in which we serve Hashem. And in our case, the way we create our sanctuary in this world. Now, if we look at these three different types of trumos, we'll see how they correspond to Torah, Avodah, or Tefillah, and Gemilas Chasadim. The Trumas HaAdonim, the Truma, the first one of the sockets, which I said were the foundation, that corresponds to Torah. Well, how does it correspond to Torah? Because the Torah is the foundation of everything. Everything we have in Judaism, from the actual mitzvos, from the actual commandments to even the customs and the good deeds and the good character traits that one has to have, all of it comes from the Torah. So without Torah, you don't have Judaism, you don't have the foundation. The Terumah of the Shkolim, which goes for the offerings, we understand. It's very clear. The offerings, in our days, it's the tefillah, it's our prayers that correspond to the korbanos, to the offerings. And the Terumas HaMishkan, all the materials, all the various things that they used in order to construct the Mishkan, that is, in our lives, that's all the worldly matters, that's all the material things we have, through which and with which we serve Hashem. And now we can understand a little better the difference in expression in the way the Torah expressed these three, brought out these three different offerings. You see, the Torah, in the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, Shlomo Melech refers to the Torah as, he says, V'eye etzli omoin v'eye shashuim. In English, it translates that the Torah kind of says about itself, I was with him, with Hashem, as a confidant. That means the closest to Hashem, a source of delight every day. So we see that the Torah is connected to Hashem. The Torah is with Hashem. Notice the v'yikchu li, take to me, right? It's me. It's so connected to me, so connected to Hashem. And we also know that the Torah preceded the world. And therefore, even as the Torah comes down into the world, and even though it seems to connect to worldly ideas, when you learn, for example, Talmud, you talk about all kinds of worldly things, or so it seems, yet the Torah remains, so to speak, aloof. The Torah remains a step higher than that. It doesn't actually fully connect to worldly matters. Or to put it in perspective, the Torah is a Torah in itself. Versus, for example, mitzvos. In order for there to be a mitzvah, there has to be a recipient of the mitzvah. So to speak, you need to whom to command a mitzvah. Otherwise, there is no existence of a mitzvah. Whereas the Torah, the idea and the chacham of the Torah, the wisdom of the Torah, the concepts of the Torah, they pre-exist the world, as it says, alpayim shana, even 2,000 years, which means 2,000 levels even beyond and before the creation of the world. And this actually helps us understand, and we can see it as it manifests itself in an actual halacha. The halacha is that if somebody is tamei, somebody is impure, in certain circumstances, they cannot put on tefillin, they cannot do certain mitzvahs, they cannot daven even, they cannot do certain holy acts. But as far as Torah is concerned, it says that the quote, the words of Torah do not receive any tumah. In other words, even if somebody who is impure should learn Torah, he cannot contaminate it. Why? Because the Torah is beyond our reach, so to speak. We learn Torah. We have the privilege of being able to connect somewhat to Hashem through Torah, but the Torah is ultimately and inherently connected with Hashem himself. Now let's look at Avodah. Let's look at the service. It's true. I mean, what is the idea of Avodah? How is it categorized in the beginning of Chumash Vayikra? Adam ki yakriv mikem, a person who will offer from you. That means you see that the korban is about getting close to Hashem. That's the word korban. Korban comes from the root word korev, kiruv, which means getting close to Hashem. But it comes from you, from within the person. The person makes himself closer to Hashem. In the times of the offering of the karbanos, it was through bringing a korban. But now it's even in a way more obvious and more clear, because it is through the avodah. What is the avodah? The tefillah. What is tefillah? It's called avodah shebelev. It's in your heart. It's taken from your inner self and more from your spiritual part and offering it and bringing it close to Hashem. And we know that what happens when you daven, if you remember the dream of Yaakov with the ladder, that is a symbol, that is really a metaphor of davening, that you start from the lower level and you reach all the way high. How does the Torah describe it? How does the Torah describe that ladder? Roishoi magia shemaima. Its head reaches the heavens, meaning the ultimate idea of tefillah, of davening, is to get so close to Hashem, so to speak, you reach the highs, you reach the heavens, you reach Hashem himself. That is the difference between Torah and Tefillah. However, there's a common denominator. What is the common denominator between the two? In both of them, Torah and Tefillah, a person works with himself. It's about the person becoming close to Hashem. Whether he can become fully close to Hashem, ultimately, in the ultimate level, or like in Tefillah, really become close to Hashem. In Torah, you say there is still some divide, but the idea is that the person is not really so much focused on the world, the person is focused on himself. And in fact, you see, when you want to learn, you separate yourself from the world. You need as least as possible distractions. When you daven, it's you, it's your thoughts, it's your prayer. You cannot deal with distractions. You cannot deal with the world, right? You can't and therefore even in halacha, you cannot daven in an open field. You cannot daven in a noisy place. You cannot daven in a place that has inherent distractions. But mitzvos, let's look at the third category. Mitzvos, what is the idea of mitzvahs? A mitzvah is that you take a gashmistika thing You take something which is material, a physical thing, and the way it is, you don't actually change and transform it. As it is an item of this physical world, you use it for service of Hashem. And it remains an item of the physical. And one who doesn't have the eyes to see does not see any Kedusha in it, does not see any holiness. In other words, you take the Gashmias in its state and you offer it to Hashem. You take the world as it is and you make it a dwelling place for Hashem. Whereas Torah, like we mentioned, Torah you don't change. You can't change the Torah. It's not changeable. And even Tefillah, even Avodah. And by the way, one can think to make the argument, well, they did offer korbanos, they did offer physical animals, they did offer animals on the Mizbeach, so you do see it taking a worldly thing and transforming it and elevating it to Kedusha. That is true, but it's not as a regular mitzvah. Why? Because the halacha is that before you can offer an animal on the Mizbeach, you had to first consecrate it. The moment you consecrate it, it's no longer just a physical object. It's no longer just a regular mundane item. It already became something holy. After it becomes holy, then you can offer it on the Mizbeach. Whereas a mitzvah, let's take the mitzvah of tzedakah. Do you first consecrate the dollar? Does the dollar become holy? The dollar is the same dollar before you gave it to tzedakah, after you gave it to tzedakah. Nothing changed in that dollar. It's still a dollar. And it's accomplished a mitzvah now. It's made the world a place which is a dwelling place for Hashem. And this actually helps us understand something about mitzvahs. Why is it that when it comes to mitzvahs, you see that there's always a size, there's always a limit, there's always a medida and hagbala. It has to be done this way and not that way. It has to be done at least this amount, and sometimes there's a maximum amount. Why? Because mitzvahs are connected to Gashmias. Mitzvahs are done with Gashmias. Mitzvah is in the Gashmias of the world. The Gashmias of the world, by definition, is something that has a limitation. It has a finite size, big or small, thin or thick, whatever it is. But the world, by definition, is something finite. And therefore, when we're doing the mitzvahs with worldly things, we're doing the mitzvahs with Gashmias, it needs to conform to the reality of the Gashmias. When it comes to Torah, we know that Torah, it says, Arucha me'eretz midah. Torah is beyond any whatsoever measurement. It's, so to speak, longer than the earth, greater than the world, larger than life. When it comes to tefillah, as we said, Rosh Magia Shemaima, you reach the heavens, the sky is the limit, meaning there is no limit. But when it comes to mitzvahs, there's a limit. You can't take 2 esrogim. You cannot put on. You cannot have 5 tzitzis on a 4-cornered garment. You just can't do that. It doesn't do the mitzvah. Not only does it do the mitzvah, that defeats the whole purpose. This will help us understand the wording in the psukim. Look at the first pasuk. It doesn't say v'yitnu li truma, they shall give to me a truma, but v'yikchu li, they shall take from me. In other words, when you're learning Torah, you're, so to speak, drawing down from above. You're taking. It's not us giving, so to speak, from ourselves. It's not us giving from the world. We're taking. We're trying to take from the holiness of Torah and draw it down. However, it still remains 2 words. V'yikchu, they shall take, li, to me. What does that point out? That no matter how much one takes, there is still somewhat of a divide, as we explained. The Torah does not fully mix with the world. The Torah does not fully become part of the world. And therefore, there is somewhat of a divide. There's somewhat of a separation. Okay? However, when it comes to the aspect of prayer, there we have the thing where the person elevates himself, the person becomes higher and is reaching higher, and he becomes, so to speak, connected to Hashem as much as a human being can become connected, and as great as his tefillah is. There you see that there is, it says, Yitnu as Terumah, they shall give. You're giving from yourself, and you're trying to get higher and closer to Hashem. And Terumah is one word. My Terumah is one word. You actually do become connected to Hashem. With tefillah, you could become connected to Hashem. However, when it comes to the third Terumah, which represents our day-to-day avodah in service of Hashem, over there it doesn't explicitly say the connection to Hashem. Why? Because as we said, as we mentioned, we explained, when you do something with the world, when you, even though you affect the Gashmias, you bring holiness into it, but you don't actually see the change. You don't see the transformation. Gashmias remains Gashmias. The physical still remains the physical. The material still has the appearance of the material. However, it is the ultimate. When it comes to service of Hashem, when it comes to making this world a sanctuary for Hashem, a dira, a dwelling place for Hashem, this is the ultimate purpose. This is the ultimate objective in the creation of the world. Even more than the study of Torah and than the service through serving Hashem through karbonos, or in our days through tefillah. And as the Alter Rebbe stresses, that this is a dira, Hashem wants a dwelling place. That means He wants a place where you can feel absolutely comfortable, down here in the lowest of the low. Since this is the ultimate objective, therefore, when it came to the first two, Torah and Tefillah, it's mentioned more in an ambiguous manner. Very generalization, without details. But when it comes to this, the Torah actually spells out every detail, every material that's used. Think about it in a sense of where is the most work, where's the most effort put into. Let's say when you're building a home. Yes, there's a lot of effort and a lot of thought and attention that has to be put into the plans and to the permits and everything. But the actual building, the actual furnishing, takes up the most time and most energy, because that is the main purpose. That's where everything is really happening. And now we can understand that medrash. The medrash, which would seem to be so misunderstood and so maybe even absurd, actually makes sense. Because when the Torah is speaking about the building of the Mishkan, at least in the level of the Medrash, in the homiletics, it's not just talking about the actual Mishkan back there in the desert. It's talking about your Mishkan, my Mishkan. It's talking about our dwelling place that we make for Hashem. In this world, there is no greater dwelling place that's made. There's no greater effect on the Gashmias, on the lowest of the low, the lowest point of Gashmias, than when we are in Golus, on the various types of Golus, beginning with Bavel and ending with the one that we're in now, the Golus Edom, the Golus of Rome, that there we actually get to reach the lowest tier of Gashmias, and with that and through that, build a dwelling place to Hashem. And that's why it's hinted in the verses as expressed by the Medrash. And of course, this will be revealed ultimately when Mashiach comes, that we'll see how the ultimate of service of Hashem is actually not like it seems today in the study of Torah and in the, what it seems to the naked eye, and in the process of prayer, rather in action, in the building of a dwelling place for Hashem.